The first modernist poet that we see is William Butler Yeats, who lived between 1865 and 1939. We will pay attention to historical and literary context, see the life of Yeats briefly, and then analyze two poems, The Second Coming and Sailing to Byzantium. We will offer two readings, special critical readings for these poems. When we come to the historical and literary context, we see that Victorian poetry was there, Edwardian and Georgian cultural climate was there. We have Irish rebellions in 1916, 1920, and then Irish independence in 1922. We have also these two great world wars, First World War and Second World War. In spite of all this, in literary terms, we find the persistence of Romantic and Victorian poetry in Edwardian and Georgian poetry, and against which we have this modernist movement led by Ezra Pound. We have key texts of this modernist period in Eliot's The Wasteland. When it comes to novel, we have James Joyce's Ulysses, and then we have Yeats' own poems, Michael Roberts and The Dancer, and we also notice Yeats' A Tower. We will have some background information about these two poems so that we can appreciate them much better. The Second Coming is a lyrical poem of 22 lines with 2 verse paragraphs. It was written in 1919 and published in 1920. Yeats deals with the theme of anarchy and uncertain future in this poem. This poem has given the title for Achebe's famous novel Things Fall Apart, published in 1958. Next poem is Sailing to Byzantium, which has 32 lines in 4 stanzas. It is also a lyrical poem written in 1926 and published in 1928. It explores an alternative outlook on life. It appears that many modernist poets were looking for something elsewhere. In the case of Yeats, he never visited Byzantium, but he saw the Byzantine art in Italy, read deeply into Byzantine history and culture, and he found some meaning in Byzantium art. First, let us read this poem, The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand, surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, gazed blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. The thematic contrast we have in this poem is between center and periphery, order and disorder, innocence and experience, the best and the worst kinds of people, animal, human, divine characteristics, light and darkness, birth and death. Here we have a picture of this gyre moving around, which starts from one center to the periphery, and then it is a continuous movement. We have a number of poetic devices in this poem, like allusion, the second coming. The title itself is a kind of reference to the second coming of Christ. We have assonance and alliteration both in the same line, turning and turning in the widening gyre. Consonants we have in blood, dim, tide is loosed. We have indicated the consonants through the highlight D with the red color. Similarly, in the previous line we have indicated assonance through blue color and alliteration through underlining. We have a symbol in the falcon and also the world. The allusion, as we said earlier, is the second coming, referring to the return of Christ. And then we have symbols in the desert birds referring to death, and the symbol again in the shape with lion body sphinx, perhaps referring to Antichrist. We have symbol again for darkness in terms of chaos, and then we have alliteration darkness drops, stony sleep. This stony sleep further has another one device called transferred epithet. Then we have symbol of this sleep for death. We have some occasional partial rhymes in this poem: hold, world, man, sun. We have a number of repetition of words in turning, surely, second coming. The line length is 10 syllables in an average in every line. Then we have this iambic pentameter with many variations. Despite the fact that Yeats is a modernist poet, he used iambic pentameter, whereas Pound wanted to break this iambic pentameter. Let us see these 4 lines here. We have indicated the number of feet in brackets 5 plus, 4 plus means that we have the variation. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. We have variations in this meter, trochee we have, spondy we have, trochee in turning, spondy in things fall. To give an overall understanding of this poem, we can say as follows: the second coming questions the relevance of divine redemption for human beings in the wake of the First World War and the failure of the first coming of Christ. Christ came to the world to redeem humanity, but the world wars did not indicate the real meaning of the coming of Christ. Yeats was profoundly concerned with the sufferings of the Irish people in the hands of the British, both of which were not saved either by Catholic religion or by Protestant religion. Both are forms of Christianity. It is a clear case of this failure of religion to protect people. The First World War further signified the arrival of the great violent and aggressive beastly creature Sphinx, which could not bring peace but destruction and bloodshed throughout Europe. The poet interrogates the Western civilization which failed to create a peaceful social order through its central religious and cultural beliefs. We have an interrogative reading of this poem or all the poems of Yeats by Feldman. He raises a question: why do 36 poems of Yeats end with questions? It seems he has counted all the poems which have questions at the end. So here he says, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. He takes this as a question for his discussion. Another critic, H.R. Joss, holds that lyric is monologic, but Feldman argues that Yeats makes his lyrics dialogic through questions. Using questions in his poems has given Yeats a chance for dialogue with the readers with humanity. The Yeatsian poem is an interrogative lyric that presents knowledge as a form of dialogical engagement. The knowledge created by the poet and the reader is hybrid knowledge. It is a mixed knowledge. Interrogative poetry reveals what we know and more importantly what we do not know. That is why Yeats is a great poet. We become one with the poet by sharing our knowledge to complement the poets, says Feldman in his article published in 2014. So, this kind of interrogative reading of Yeats poetry is useful to understand how readers also contribute complement meanings to poems. Let us move on to the next poem, Sailing to Byzantium. That's no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh or fowl commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born and dies, caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is their singing school but studying monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of your wall, come from the holy fire, burn in your gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fasten to a dying animal, it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium, or what is past or passing or to come. This poem has this thematic contrast between youth on the one hand, old age on the other, birth and death, emotion, intellect, holy and ugly, sages and fornicators, people who involve in sexual acts uncontrollably. Then we have time and eternity, man, animal, art, past, present and future, body and soul. Finally, Yeats was always interested in the conflict between art and life. That is why we have a poem like this which deals with art in art. These poetic devices contribute to an understanding of this poem, how this poem has been made into an art. We have the imagery of nature and fertility in these two lines, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees. On the one hand, human beings we have fornicating, and on the other hand we have birds in the trees singing. We have alliteration in fish, flesh or fowl. The metaphor is clearly seen in an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. When we have a coat, torn coat on a stick, we can see the old man's picture. Consonants we have in tattered coat upon a stick, assonance in clap and hand, alliteration again in singing school but studying, monuments of magnificence sail the seas. Complex rhythmic pattern we have in these lines, that is why we have highlighted and also underlined. That means yam is one alliteration, n is another kind of consonants. Further we have assonance in to the holy city of Byzantium. Allusion is there in the emperor and the golden bird. In mythical stories we have the metaphor of mental journey to Byzantium for a spiritual transcendence through art. It's what it always to transcend this human life to reach a high level of life in art. We must remember that Yeats was trying to communicate through different kinds of medium that was available to him at that time. Through his wife, he was interested in astrology, he was interested in many kinds of images, symbols. He created his own symbols in a book called A Vision. He was always trying to communicate and understand the nature of life and transcend the limitations of life through art. Let us see the rhyme, rhythm and meter in this poem. The stanza form of this poem is called Autova Rima. It has 8 lines, and this form was introduced to England by Thomas Wyatt, our Elizabethan poet, sonneteer that we saw earlier. It was exploited further by Lord Byron in his famous poem Don Juan. This poem has 4 stanzas of 8 lines each in blank verse. We have rhyme. This is represented in ABA, BAB, CC. So, ABA, the middle line B starts this next set B, and then we have CC. We have young, trees, song, seas, long, dies, neglect, intellect in stanza 1. We have iambic pentameter with many variations. That's no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds into trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas. We have this enjambment as well, that is why we have indicated the young in one another's arms. We also have full stop in the middle of the first line, that is no country for old men, end stop we have, but this line continues thereafter of this stop, strong stop. We have also caesura, in one another's arms. Here we have the overall understanding of this poem. The poem deals with the theme of aging and the soul's aspiration for transcendence into art. An old man has an option to feel depressed on seeing an unfit country of passionate living men and women, but then he can choose to sail to the city of great art and become immortal. The poet asserts that the human spirit can achieve immortality through the Byzantine art of painted, sculpted sages and birds singing to the audience. Yeats sings his vision of eternal life beyond the sickness of life through a search for healing in an artifice of eternity that he could see in Byzantine art. We have a Platonic reading here. This poem is called Yeats' perfect poem by Notopoulos. He calls this one of the great lyrics of 20th century. It is a remarkable Platonic lyric for its exploration of the contrast between the earthly sensual delight and the eternal intellectual bliss. This poem is driven by the wasteland of Yeats' personal life to Plato. In stanza 1 we have a Platonic view of mortality. In stanza 2 we have Platonism and sailing to Byzantium, and in stanza 3 the wisdom of the singing masters, and in the fourth stanza we have the golden bird song of eternity. In Plato's Republic book 10 we have this myth of In this myth we have the soul of Orpheus turning into a swan and that of Tamaras into a nightingale. Similarly, Yeats' soul chooses the golden bird to sing eternally. We have the summary of this lecture here. We saw the historical and literary context of W.B. Yeats, a modernist poet who wrote a number of poems, including the two poems we have chosen to discuss: The Second Coming, published in 1920, Sailing to Byzantium, published in 1928. We offered two readings of these poems, an interrogative reading for The Second Coming, which ends with a question, and the second poem, Sailing to Byzantium, which deals with the soul's quest for eternity, and we offered a Platonic reading for this poem. Some references are here for you. Thank you, explore and enjoy.